picture this. It's a beautiful summer day in 1974. Kids are out of school, the sun is shining, and in this small town, Monticello, Minnesota, the Vanlith family is getting ready for not one but two celebrations.
Oh, wow.
Their oldest daughter's graduating high school, and then she's shipping off to join the military.
Oh, wow. That's a lot.
But in the middle of all this excitement, something terrible happens. 17-year-old Belinda Vanlith disappears.
Oh, no.
It's a mystery that haunts the community to this day. So today, we are going to dive deep into Belinda's case. We'll try to piece together the events and look at the suspects and all those unanswered questions that still remain decades later.
You know what really gets me about this case is just how it shows how vulnerable we all are, like especially when things seem normal. You have this small town, a family excited for the future, and then bam, it's all gone. It's like a scary reminder that even when things seem ordinary, the unexpected can just happen.
Absolutely. And when you look at what we have about Belinda, you really get a sense of who she was. She was a quiet girl, close to her family. She loved to sew, and she always wore this really unique troll necklace.
Oh, interesting.
At the time, she was house-sitting for a local musician named Dwayne Cornwell. He was on a trip to Nashville. When he came back, Belinda was gone.
And the police response at first is kind of strange. The first deputy who got there seemed to just immediately suspect Dwayne. He had a history of domestic disturbances, and the deputy just kind of fixated on that. Maybe he missed other possibilities.
Yeah, there were some pretty creepy details at the scene. The window screen was cut, but there wasn't any sign of forced entry. Some of Belinda's things were missing, like her jeans and a bedspread, but other stuff like her makeup and her class ring was still there.
So it's almost as if whoever took her wanted to make it seem like she just took off.
Right.
But then why leave behind stuff that she would need if she ran away? It doesn't make any sense.
And speaking of things not making sense, Dwayne's alibi about his Nashville trip fell apart pretty quickly.
Oh, really?
The police called the hotel he said he stayed at, and guess what? He had checked out 2 days earlier than he originally told them.
That's not good. That's the big difference. Makes you think, was he lying to the police? Or was there some other explanation that nobody looked into?
But here's where it gets even more confusing. Despite his alibi not adding up, Dwayne was cleared by the police.
Really?
The sources we have don't say why, which is frustrating, but it feels like a really important piece of the puzzle.
It's like a hole in the story. It leaves you with more questions than answers. Why would they clear him even though the hotel story didn't match up? Did they find something else that supported his story? Or maybe someone was pushing them to close the case quickly? Who knows?
And all this was happening while Belinda's family was frantically searching for her. They were sure she wouldn't have run away, especially not right before her dad's birthday and her sister's big celebrations.
Yeah, you can really feel their frustration with the whole runaway theory when you look at the sources. They knew their daughter. They knew she wouldn't just vanish, especially with so much going on in their lives.
As the investigation went on, though, new leads started to pop up. There was talk about Belinda possibly hitchhiking with another girl. And then someone found women's clothes just abandoned in a park.
Interesting. So did the clothes belong to Belinda or this other girl? Were there any witnesses? The police reports don't really say.
Like they were chasing ghosts, trying to grab onto anything, but never really connecting the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And then the case takes a really dark turn with this guy, Tim Crosby.
Okay, so who is Tim Crosby?
He was a neighbor. Belinda had visited just the day before she vanished. A few months later, he was arrested for a horrible crime. He kidnapped and assaulted another young woman.
Oh my gosh.
And the details of that crime are awful. It happened right across the street from where Belinda was last seen. When the police searched his parents' house, they found something really scary. A list of 50 ways to get rid of a body.
Oh my goodness. Are you serious?
A list. And one of the ways on that list, and this is where it gets really creepy, was to put the body in a manure pile. And get this.
Oh no.
Neighbors had seen Tim's car covered in manure that very same week.
No way. This is getting scary.
Yeah, it's like something out of a nightmare. When they asked him about it, Tim said he got stuck in a manure pile. But even that story didn't hold up. The police talked to the farmers who all pull him out, and they said Tim didn't seem drunk, which contradicted his first story about being wasted.
So many things don't add up. So many questions. And then there's the whole polygraph thing. Tim agreed to take one, and the examiner said he wasn't being truthful about what he knew about Belinda's disappearance. You'd think that would be a big deal for the investigation, but our sources don't mention the police doing anything about it right away.
It's a weird gap in the information. Was the polygraph not enough evidence? Were they too focused on the other crime he committed? We just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
What we do know is that Tim was convicted for the kidnapping and assault, but Belinda's disappearance is still a mystery. That's where things stood for almost 20 years. But in 1992, investigators decided to take another look at the case. They interviewed Tim again and officially named him as a suspect in Belinda's disappearance.
So they were still actively working on the case, even after all that time. It's pretty amazing how persistent they were. And how did Tim react to being interviewed again?
Well, his response was both interesting and kind of infuriating. He just asked, when you find her, are you going to apologize?
Wow. What do you think he meant by that? Was he mocking the police, or was he trying to say he was innocent in some twisted way? It's hard to figure out what he was thinking.
Right. It can mean a lot of things, but it definitely feels like he knows more than he's saying. Then he goes on to say that someone he knew saw Belinda in Montello after she disappeared.
Another lead maybe. But the sources don't say if the police looked into it or if they just thought he was making it up.
And then just like that, Tim ends the interview. He says, there's no law saying I have to talk to you. Another dead end.
It's so frustrating, but even though the 1992 interview didn't give us any real answers, it did show that people were still thinking about the case. And with all the new forensic technology, you'd think they might have looked at some of the physical evidence again, right?
Totally. In the early 90s, DNA testing was starting to change everything. Maybe they looked at the clothes they found in the park again, or any other things they collected. Maybe there were fingerprints or other trace evidence they could test with the new methods.
That makes sense.
The sources don't say if they did any specific forensic testing, but it's definitely a possibility. And then another decade goes by, and in 2002, there's a new twist.
What happened?
One of Belinda's relatives comes forward with information about a new suspect.
Oh, wow. It makes you wonder why they didn't say anything sooner.
Maybe they were scared. Or maybe they just recently put the pieces together. It's not that unusual for people to wait years or even decades before they feel brave enough or before the right situation comes up to share what they know.
Yeah, that's human nature.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a while to process something traumatic or to come to terms with what you know. But the big question is, who is this new suspect?
And get this, the sources don't say who it is.
Oh, come on, seriously. That's a huge cliffhanger. It's possible they didn't want to say because they wanted to protect the investigation, especially if it was still active when these sources were put together.
So we're left with more questions than answers. Were Dwayne and Tim connected? What about this new suspect? What really happened to Belinda?
These are the questions that people who knew and loved Belinda still think about. Her story shows us that hope never dies, that life is fragile, and that we should never stop searching for the truth.
Even when we don't have concrete answers, it's important to keep talking about these cases, to keep asking questions, and to never forget the victims.
I agree. Belinda's case, like so many others, reminds us that we need to be careful, thorough, and most importantly, empathetic when we investigate these things.
And it reminds us that danger can be lurking even when things seem normal. We need to be aware, trust our gut, and look out for each other.
That's a really important point. It's scary to think about, but it's also a call to action. If we learn anything from Belinda's story, it's that we can't just sit back and do nothing. We need to be careful, speak up when we see something wrong, and support the people who are trying to find answers.
That's a great way to put it. It's easy to get lost in all the twists and turns of a case like this, but we can't forget the human cost. Belinda was someone's daughter, sister, and friend. The people who loved her still feel her absence.
And that's why we have to keep her memory alive, keep looking for answers, and never let her story be forgotten.
This deep dive has shown us that finding justice can be hard, but that we should never give up on the truth. Belinda's case, with all its mysteries and unanswered questions, makes us think about how important it is to stay alert, to pay attention to details, and to never lose hope.
And to all our listeners, I'll leave you with this thought. Pay attention to the things that seem ordinary, to the little details that others might miss. You never know what little piece of information might be the key to solving a mystery and finally bringing closure to a case like Belinda's. So many things just don't add up, so many questions. And then there's the whole polygraph thing. Tim agreed to take one, and the examiner said he wasn't being truthful about what he knew about Belinda's disappearance. You'd think that would be a big deal for the investigation. But our sources don't mention the police doing anything about it right away.
Yeah, it's a strange gap in the information. Was the polygraph not enough evidence? Were they more focused on the other crime he committed? We just don't know for sure. What we do know is that Tim was convicted for that kidnapping and assault. But Belinda's disappearance is still a total mystery.
Right, and that's where things stayed for almost 20 years. But then in 1992, the investigators decided to take another look at the case.
Oh, really?
They interviewed Tim again, and this time they officially named him as a suspect in Belinda's disappearance.
That's interesting. So were they still actively working on the case after all those years?
It seems so. It's pretty incredible how persistent they were. And you know what's really fascinating is how Tim reacted when they questioned him again.
Okay, so what did he say?
Well, his response was both interesting and infuriating. He simply asked, "When you find her, are you going to apologize?"
Wow. What do you think he meant by that? Was he trying to be sarcastic and mock the police? Or was it some twisted way of claiming he was innocent? It's hard to tell what he was thinking.
Exactly. It's open to interpretation, but it definitely suggests that he knows more than he's letting on. And then he goes on to claim that someone he knew saw Belinda in Monticello after she disappeared.
Huh. So that's another possible lead, right?
It could be, but frustratingly, the sources don't tell us whether the police investigated that claim or if they just dismissed it as a lie.
Right. And then just as abruptly as it began, the interview ends. Tim shuts it down by saying, "There's no law that says I have to talk to you."
Another dead end. It's so frustrating.
I know. It is frustrating. But even though that 1992 interview didn't give us any concrete answers, it does show that the case was still on people's minds. With all the advancements in forensic technology since then, you'd think they might have taken another look at the physical evidence.
Absolutely. In the early 90s, DNA testing was starting to revolutionize how we solve crimes. Maybe they re-examined the clothes they found in the park or any of the other evidence they had. Maybe there were fingerprints or other trace evidence they could analyze with the new techniques.
It's definitely possible. The sources don't mention any specific forensic analysis being done, but it could have happened. And then another decade goes by, and in 2002, a new twist emerges.
Oh, wow. What happened?
A relative of Belinda's comes forward with information about a new suspect.
Really? That's
Yeah.
crazy. It makes you wonder why they waited so long to come forward.
You know, it's possible they were scared. Or maybe they only just recently connected the dots. It's not uncommon for people to hold on to information for years, even decades, before they're ready to share it.
That's true. Sometimes it takes time to process a traumatic event or to come to terms with what you know. But the big question here is, who is this new suspect?
And unfortunately, the sources don't reveal their identity.
Oh, come on. Seriously. That's such a cliffhanger. It's possible they didn't include that information to protect the investigation, especially if the case was still active when these sources were compiled.
That's so frustrating. So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions. Were Dwayne and Tim somehow connected? What about this new suspect? And ultimately, what really happened to Belinda?
These are the questions that continue to haunt anyone who knew and loved Belinda. Her story is a powerful reminder that hope endures, that life is fragile, and that the search for truth should never be abandoned.
Even when we don't have all the answers, it's so important to keep these cases alive, to keep asking those questions, and to never forget the victims.
Absolutely. Belinda's case, like so many others, highlights the need for diligence, thoroughness, and above all, empathy in investigations.
And it's a stark reminder that danger can be present even in the most ordinary circumstances. We need to be aware, trust our instincts, and look out for one another.
That's a really important message. It can be scary to think about, but it's also a call to action. We can learn from Belinda's story. If we learn anything, it's that we can't afford to be complacent. We need to be vigilant, speak up when we see something wrong, and support those who are searching for answers.
You know, it's easy to get bogged down in the unknowns, all the what-ifs, and just the sheer amount of time that's passed. But what really strikes me is how even after all these years, one new piece of information, one fresh look at things, could totally change the whole case.
Yeah, and that's what keeps so many investigators, families, and advocates going, that hope. Think about all the advances in DNA technology since Belinda disappeared. What seemed impossible to solve back then might be totally doable now.
It really makes you wonder if there's something sitting in an evidence locker somewhere, just waiting for the right technology to come along and unlock its secrets.
It's definitely possible. And it's not always just about forensic science. Sometimes it's a witness finally speaking up or a new connection being made that changes everything.
Exactly. And that's where our listeners come in. We've gone over a lot in this deep dive. The troll necklace Belinda always wore, the cut window screen at Dwayne's house, Tim Crosby and that scary list, the manure pile.
All those things might seem small on their own, but they could be really important pieces of the puzzle. Sometimes a tiny detail can trigger a memory, a connection, a vital clue.
Absolutely. And there are still so many questions that need answers. Why was Dwayne cleared even though his alibi didn't add up? What about the clothes found in the park? Were they ever linked to Belinda or the girl she was supposedly with?
If any of this rings a bell for you, if anything we've talked about makes you think of something, no matter how small or unimportant it might seem, please contact the authorities.
Even the smallest bit of recognition could be what this case needs. Don't underestimate what you might have seen or remembered.
We can't let Belinda's story be forgotten. We have to keep her memory alive and keep searching for the truth.
This deep dive has been a really powerful reminder that justice can be hard to find. But the search for truth should never stop. Belinda's case, with all its twists and turns and unanswered questions, challenges us to stay aware, to pay attention, and to never give up hope.
That's a great point. And to our listeners, I want to leave you with this thought. Pay attention to the everyday things, the little details that most people wouldn't even notice. You never know what piece of information might be the key to solving a mystery and finally giving closure to a case like Belinda's.